Welcome to the Book Show, a celebration of reading and writers. I'm Joe Donahue. Sheila Heti is a philosopher of modern experience and has reimagined what a book can hold. In her latest, Pure Color, she presents a contemporary Bible, an atlas of feeling, and an absurdly funny guide to the great and terrible things about being alive. In this first draft of the world, a woman named Mira leaves home to study. There she meets Annie, whose tremendous power opens Mira's chest like a portal to what she doesn't know. When Mira is older, her beloved father dies, and his spirit passes into her. Together, they become a leaf on a tree. But photosynthesis gets boring, and being alive is a problem that cannot be solved even by a leaf. Eventually, Mira must remember the human world she's left behind, including Annie, and choose whether or not to return. Sheila Heti is the author of several books of fiction and nonfiction, including Motherhood and How Should a Person Be, which New York Magazine deemed one of the new classics of the 21st century. Again, the new novel is Pure Color, and it is a great pleasure to welcome Sheila Heti to this week's book show. Thank you very much for being with us. What a delight to have you on the program.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Give us a sense of how you started this book. I know things change midstream, but the original idea of what you wanted to address.
I started off with this sentence in my head: God is three art critics in the sky, which is a sentence that I had in my head for 15 years. When I started writing How Should a Person Be, it was just a piece of paper, this note card that I carried around that had that sentence on it. And over the years, I kept thinking, what does that mean? And I couldn't figure it out. It's one of those sentences that just kind of come to you and it's a puzzle. And finally, I think when I started writing this book, I thought, okay, now I can sort of try to figure that sentence out that's kind of haunted me. I guess what I figured out was that if God is three art critics in the sky, then the universe has to be an artwork,
Mhm.
God's creation. And then came the idea that God sort of made humans in order to be the critics of his existence, of this world. Because one of the things that I was thinking about when I started writing the book was, why are we always so critical of everything? Like, we are given this amazing gift of life, and yet we can't really enjoy it because everything bugs us. Like the shower stops in the middle, because your neighbors flush the toilet, and like everything's just so frustrating. So I thought, why are we just so critical of everything? And I think those two ideas came together, that sentence and this frustration that we can't enjoy the beauty.
Ready to go at creation a second time, hoping to get it more right this time, God appears, splits, and manifests as three critics in the sky: a large bird who critiques from above, a large fish who critiques from the middle, and a large bear who critiques while cradling creation in its arms. Talk about those three entities: the bird, the fish, the bear, of how they came to be the three critics.
Well, I spent a long time thinking about why three, and if there have to be three, what's the difference between them all? And I actually just recently looked back on my notes for the book, and I saw how much of a struggle it had been to figure those out. How many hundreds of thousands of words that had been written to figure it out. But in the end, what I came to was that the bird people are like, they see the world aesthetically primarily. They're interested in beauty, order, harmony, meaning. They're like the artists, the critics, the most closest to, yeah. Well, I would consider myself a bird. And then the people that critique the world, like fish, are thinking about collective conditions, justice, the well-being of the many. They're more activist types. And then the bear people are the ones who are sort of interested in their own and people that are close to them, their families, their loved ones. And so these are sort of three primary modes of experiencing the world that dominate. Not to say we don't all have all of them in us, but that what's the dominant one? And the idea is that, like, none of these three kinds of people really understand each other or can truly value
Mm.
each other, or they all think the other ones have their priorities all wrong. So, but I kind of want to show that God needs all of them, like that the world needs all these different perspectives, and they sort of interlock to create our universe and to make it better.
Mira is the main character in the novel. Did you immediately identify as that character?
Yeah, I mean, I guess she's most of all the stand-in for me.
You write, but being unlikable wasn't the reason she was alone. She was alone so she could hear herself thinking. She was alone so she could hear herself living. That's a beautiful sentence.
Thank you.
It just seems to me that we don't listen enough about that, do we? To figure that out.
I mean, you're a reader, you know how nice it is to be alone.
Yes. I was struck by something you said earlier where you were kind of haunted by those initial words over a decade and a half. And when you figure it out, is that great excitement is living to the point where you can hear it.
Yeah, probably. I think it was also just part of it is, with a lot of books, they kind of come out of a neuroses or something you have to attend to. So there's a kind of chaotic energy to the book because it's what must be written. But I felt like with this book, I had sort of grown up enough and calmed
Mm.
down enough that I was able to choose what to write about. So that's also like hearing yourself living. It's like finally enough of the chaos of being young settles down so you can really hear the things that you want to think about.
Sheila Heti is our guest on this week's book show. The name of the new novel is Pure Color. You have said that you'd been dreading the death of your father, then that took place while you were writing this novel. So even though you had that choice, this thing that you did not choose, obviously, happened. And so it has a great impact.
Yeah, I mean, once I had chosen the book that I wanted to write, it did what it always does, which is find it just sort of takes over, and it it has its own, I don't know, purpose. And, life happens and that intersects with whatever you're thinking about and whatever you're writing about and whatever you're feeling. So yeah, the death of my father about 9 months or so into working on the book changed the direction of it in a way that was, when I started writing about my father's death after he died, I didn't think it was going to be part of the book. I was just writing it down to remember what had happened. And so I didn't forget because it just felt so important to keep that memory close forever. And then, a few months later, I thought, well, actually, this has something to do with the book. And I tried to see if it fit in, and it did. And it seemed, I can't even imagine how I imagined that the whole book could have gone from beginning to end without this break in the middle. Without this feeling of like, well, here's the second draft of Nira's life now that her father's dead.
I love that idea of writing it down before you forget the feeling, because that does happen. Obviously, you forget. Having lost both my parents, you forget, and there are things that you forget about it, and so there is a beauty that you write about that is remarkable of how wonderfully and perfectly it fits into the novel, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing that I thought that I would forget was that when you're experiencing somebody, or when I experienced my father dying, that there was a lot of beauty and joy and magic and
Mm.
there's like a mystical element to it. And I thought that if I didn't write down all those details, which surprised me so much, then I would revert to just feeling like, well, that was sad and hard and all the ways that death is depicted because, our depictions, in literature and other art forms inform our memories and tell us what to remember. And I didn't want to remember it wrong. And I guess part of the reason I wanted to bring it into the book was because I didn't see a lot of depictions of death like that.
Grief, of course, comes or can come in stages, and there's facets of it, of course. Did you find that changing as you were writing of how you felt as you were going through it? Because it's a very real process that winds up on the page very soon
Yeah,
after as you're feeling it in real time, really.
yeah, I mean, I kept thinking the book was done, and then, 6 months would pass, and I would be in a completely different stage psychologically and emotionally, and there would be more to write. So, yeah, I do think everything I kept changing, and so the book kept changing. Yeah, definitely.
Where were you to the point where you thought, okay, this can be very much a part of this novel, that as you start and you're looking at art criticism and then you make this leap really to your father and becoming part of your father, that is is beautiful and makes perfect sense of where that became so natural.
Yeah, I mean, it's weird. The whole thing feels kind of predestined because um I can't, like I said, I can't imagine the book being any other way.
Hmm.
I mean, I knew my father was sick, so maybe some part of me knew that he was going to die. So like I mean, he had cancer, so when I started the book, he'd already received his diagnosis. So it's not like he was hit by a train and it was
Right.
such a sudden surprise. So I think that there was a part of me that was ready to think about God and what that means to me and the soul and death and different drafts of life. Because when a parent dies, the whole universe feels like it's a new universe. So maybe unconsciously, I'd already connected those ideas before I started writing.
Did you feel orphaned in a way?
Totally. Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, I still have my mother,
Right.
but I still did nevertheless. Yeah.
It is a very spiritual book. Did you think you would write such a spiritual book?
I mean, if I look back to myself as a child, I was a really spiritual child, but that, I grew up in a very atheistic
Hmm.
household. So I never really thought about God much because it was always kind of ridiculed in my home, like, only you have to be pretty dumb to think that there's a God sort of thing. But then even as my father, who was the person who would have said that all my life, even as he was close to death, I think he started to feel like, well, maybe I was too certain about certain things and about that. And so I don't know if I was surprised that it was a spiritual book. I think it was time to write that for me.
Sheila Heti is our guest. The name of the new book is Pure Color, a novel. I find in reading about you and reading about your work that I wonder how you take this of when people write that you write in such an abstract way and the book is undefinable and difficult to explain and there's such an abstract nature to it. Do you feel that that is true and that it because I found this so relatable that as I read that I thought I didn't find that certainly abstract ideas, but they're beautifully realized in a very you certainly give us a roadmap to the understanding.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very simple book. I think the language is very simple and, I don't use complicated words and I think one thing follows from the next. I mean, I guess if your expectations of a book are very rigid, then this book might feel perplexing, but if you're open to just reading, you're just read page to page and sentence to sentence. I think the book welcomes people in.
You have said that it's another way to look at a book. Why did you think we were, we as an audience were ready for that?
Oh, I don't know what the audience is ready for or not. It's just me, like I love books, the same way I love people. And when you make a book or when I make a book, it's like making it's like don't you want to meet somebody like you've never met before?
Right.
And so I kind of feel like the same thing about a book. Like don't you want to read a book like it's a person that just a special person you've never met anyone like this person. So that's what I look for as a reader and that's what I want to write.
We were talking about how your father's death changed the course and came in several months into the writing. Did it alter the course of how the novel would ultimately end in your mind of the really the journey that this character goes on?
I mean, I was just being led by the book, I didn't know where it was gonna end up, and I kept thinking I was done, and then I would write more, and then I would think, "Well, okay, now I'm done," and then I would write more, and even after I handed the book to the publisher and then my publisher accepted it, and, I had this one night where I just, like, wrote the real end, and so things kept unfolding for me, so it was really a surprise. I don't think I knew where I was going in terms of plot. But I feel like when I wrote those last pages that I must have that those last pages must have been really, really known to me all the way through, but I didn't know them because they just made everything make sense. Like, I had this feeling like, "Oh, I don't have the end. I don't have the end. Am I ever gonna get the end?" And then when I wrote those, it just couldn't have been more perfect, and it just drew the whole book together and made it all make even more sense, I think.
It certainly does, and it's so true to what you had written before. It's not in any way veering off course. It's very much a part of the natural and beautiful story that you're telling.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, like, where art comes from in the self, because if the ending could be so perfect and could sort of answer all the questions a person might have or that I might have had in the writing of it,
Right.
if that can come only at, days after you feel like you're done, is it already all there inside you in the first moment and you're just sort of discovering it, or how does it all come about? It just was such a strange feeling. I felt like I was in a trance when I wrote those last few pages. I kind of did go into a trance. I've never had that feeling before where I felt my eyes going back and forth really fast. It was so crazy. I just that's not normally how I write.
So because that's such a powerful reaction, you assume that nothing more is going to come after that. That
Yeah,
that is
I
the
didn't want any
end.
more.
Right.
I didn't want yeah, I thought that was enough. That was far enough.
A good way to go. Tell us about the character Annie and the sort of the in and out, the on again, off again relationship between Mira and Annie.
Yeah, so Annie's a fish. She's interested in the collective. And, Mira can never get the love she wants from Annie because Annie's not ever going to love her exclusively. She loves all of humanity. She's concerned with all of humanity. So there's this frustration built into their relationship, even though right from the moment they meet, Mira just feels this deep connection. And this book kind of covers a long span of time, so they return to each other later in life, and they return to each other again, and it's always kind of exciting but kind of disappointing. And
Mm. When you started this and writing about art criticism and looking at art and just the idea of pure color, how long had that been percolating of what ultimately you wanted to say to get through?
I mean, I think I'm always writing about art. I think I wrote about art and motherhood and how should a person be. And I guess I like, in some ways, for a book to be about itself. Like, ultimately, the subject of a book is books. So, I'm always thinking about the book justifying itself,
Hmm.
and that the book in some ways knows it's a book. And so, when I started writing this, I wasn't thinking about art so much as art critics, but I was thinking about how the art critics that Manet encountered in his life, the stuff that they wrote about him in the Paris salons, how they were so angry about his work and so dismissive and hated it so much. And, he's like the father of modern painting in some way. And it's just so interesting to me why one generation can find an artist sort of despicable and ugly and offensive, and another generation, a few generations later, can find that same artist's work so beautiful. And it just I just it's interesting. It's interesting that we can't really see things for what they are. We can't see artworks for what they are. We can only see through the eyes of our time, or most of us can only see through the eyes of our time. I don't know. It's just a puzzle to me. Like, who is the art critic? What are they seeing?
Mm.
Why are they seeing what they're seeing?
And why is what they're seeing any more important than what anyone else is seeing?
I mean, they elect themselves as the important
Right.
ones.
You talk about that in school. You're talking about there's a part that you say they, the elected, they believed the future would be set in the molds that they had made. It was important to know what you thought of things, what you believed the world to be, and what you thought it should be. And then you write, they just didn't consider the fact that one day they would be walking around with phones in the future, out of which people who had far more charisma than they did would let flow an endless stream of images and words. They just had no idea that the world would become so big or the competition so stiff. It's a beautiful way of
Yeah.
putting it.
Well, the people I'm talking about in that passage are the students, including Mira, of the American Academy of American Critics.
Right.
So they're like young people hoping to be critics. And I sort of, I remember, I guess, the time before the internet and being young, and your world is so small. You just think you and your friends are the only ones, and everything you're going to do is going to be sort of important, but you just have no idea, yeah, the scope of the world, how many other people there are. Really, you don't feel their reality until, and then the internet comes and you see like all the other voices, and it's amazing, but it's also daunting. They didn't know that the world was going to become so big, and then this idea of like they think that being an art critic is the most important thing, but here are all these people with their endless streams of images and words who are so much more captivating and charismatic and beautiful. And yeah, I mean, the world's changed, and I wanted to sort of document that feeling of how things have changed, what they
How
used to be like.
how do you deal with that, of all of that endless stream of images and words that perhaps is headed and about your work? Do you pay attention to it?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I love the multiplicity of voices. I think it's really interesting, and it's rich, and it's complicated, and I love reading, you know, anybody that writes about my book. I'm curious. I don't think that it's better to I don't judge. I don't feel like, oh, the critic in the newspaper has a more valid point of view than this person on Goodreads. I'm interested in all of it because, all of it together is what makes is the reality of the impact that the book's having on people. And I'm really curious about that because that tells me how to write my next book. Like you just don't really know how art it impacts people until you see the response. And I feel like it's a conversation, like the artist and the audience are in a conversation, and my part of the conversation is the book, and then theirs is their responses, and I like that.
Do you think of it in a way that it is untraditional of how you write, or that it is very traditional? So many talk about in the reviews, so many people talk about how your novels have broken a mold and break a mold of what a novel can be, and that it is not traditional. And my curiosity was, do you see what you're doing as traditional, or is it a conscious act to try to do something different?
I don't think I'm consciously trying to do something different. I just maybe I'm interested in writing about certain things that um, need different treatment. It's not that I'm trying to be different. I'm really just doing the best I can to write something entertaining and if and interesting and engaging. I want people to get to the end of the book. Like I'm not somebody who reads to the end of books very often. I sort of lose interest. So I'm just trying to make something that keeps me interested to the end. And um, I guess I've never been one to I'm not sure to I don't always care what's going to happen next. Other things have to keep me there besides just what's going to happen next.
Well, that fascinates me. So you most of the time then you won't get through a book.
No. I sort of feel like, yeah, I get the point,
Yeah.
and that's it. And then I get I bring the artist's style inside me, and I love their senses. But I feel like, okay, I've had enough. It's like I've had enough of those chips or what, or that cake or whatever. Don't need to eat the whole entire cake.
Do you ever think that you're missing something? That's what I always worry about. Sometimes I think about bailing, and I think, oh, okay, but maybe I'll miss something.
You definitely miss a lot. Yeah, I think it's really bad. It's not a good habit. I've tried to stop. I'm better than I used to be at finishing books, and I realize, wow, like you can't really know what a book is until you finish it. So I recommend finishing books, even though I don't always do it myself.
Now, does that happen in the writing process where you'll be writing and then it's difficult for you to finish your own novel?
Mm, no, I think that I'm very drawn to finishing what I start in terms of, if I've been working on a book for 4 or 5 years,
Right.
I don't finish and I don't say that I'm done until I really 100% truly am done. I feel like, I wouldn't be able to bear publishing a book that I didn't feel was done.
And yet you have, while it may be difficult for you to get to the end of another book, that you can look and say, okay, this is what I need to do so the reader can get to the end of my book.
Yeah, I mean, I just I just think that I studied Aristotle when I studied playwriting when I was at theater school,
Yeah.
in my teens, and, he writes in the Poetics that you wanna make, a play basically, a dr that doesn't ha so if you take something away from it, the whole thing falls apart, but you don't want anything there that could be taken away, and it wouldn't change. I don't know if I'm putting that exactly right, but the whole point is that, like, I try to take away everything inessential, everything that's
Right.
not essential. So, but if you take away this paragraph, then the whole thing falls apart. So I try to take away everything just short of it falling apart. So I don't think there's a lot of, excess that you have to sort of wade through. It's kind of the essence. I wanna write a book that's like the essence of the book.
It's the tiniest, the most granular of detail that is left.
Yeah, because he talks about it in terms of animals, and he's like, "The most beautiful animal is one that you can take in one glance." And so I kind of wanna write a book that you can sort of take in one glance.
Well, the new novel is Pure Color. It is published by FSG. Sheila Heti, what a great pleasure to have you on the program, and thank you for writing such a beautiful novel.
Thanks for your questions, I really enjoyed that.
Great pleasure. Thank you. Sheila Heti's new novel is Pure Color. It is published by FSG. We enjoy hearing from our listeners about our shows. You can email us at book@wamc.org. You can listen again to this or find past book shows via podcast or at wamc.org. Sarah LeDuc produces our program. Bookmark us for next week, and thanks for listening for The Book Show. I'm Joe Donahue.